Margaret had stopped believing in miracles 3 years ago when the accident changed everything. She sat in her office on the 32nd floor watching the city move below her while she remained perfectly still in ways she never chose. Her assistant Helen had been dropping hints for months about blind dates and getting back out there as if life could simply resume where it left off. The restaurant Helen chose was one of those places with soft lighting and quiet corners where people went to fall in love or at least pretend they might. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early as was her habit from decades of running board meetings and merger negotiations. She positioned her wheelchair at a table where she could see the entrance and waited. The man who walked through the door at exactly 7 o'clock was not what she expected. His work boots were clean but well worn and his shirt was pressed but not expensive. He looked around the room with the careful attention of someone who fixes things for a living. When his eyes found her table he smiled and walked over with the kind of steady confidence that comes from knowing your hands can solve most problems. "Hello Margaret," he said, sitting down across from her without any of the awkward hesitation she had grown accustomed to. "I'm Frank and I should probably tell you up front that I have no idea what I'm doing here." She found herself almost smiling for the first time in months. "Helen told me you run a construction company," she said. Frank nodded and gestured to his hands which bore the honest scars of 30 years working with metal and wood. "Started with just me and a pickup truck," he said. "Now we've got 40 guys and more work than we can handle. But I still like to get my hands dirty when I can." There was something refreshing about his directness. In Margaret's world of corporate speak and careful positioning, people rarely said exactly what they meant. "What about you?" he asked. "Helen mentioned you run some kind of business, but she was pretty vague about the details." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she had to explain her situation. "I used to run a consulting firm," she said slowly. "We helped companies restructure and streamline operations. I was good at it." Frank waited without rushing to fill the silence. "After my accident," she continued, "I thought I would lose everything. The clients, the respect, the ability to lead. But somehow the business kept growing. People seemed to trust my judgment even more. Maybe because they knew I understood what it meant to rebuild from scratch." Frank leaned back in his chair studying her with the same attention he might give to a blueprint. "That makes sense," he said. "When you fix something that's been broken, you understand how all the pieces fit together better than someone who only sees the finished product." The waiter came and went. They ordered simple food and Frank told stories about the houses he had built and the families who lived in them. He spoke about foundation work with the same care that Margaret once reserved for discussing market strategies. There was poetry in the way he described making sure a house could weather whatever storms came its way. Margaret found herself talking about things she hadn't shared with anyone. The fear that had consumed her in those first months after the accident. The way she had to learn that strength could look different than she always thought. The surprising discovery that leading from a wheelchair had taught her things about power that she never understood before. Frank listened the way good mechanics listen to engines. Not just to the words but to what was underneath them. When she finished talking about the hardest year of her life, he nodded slowly. "My dad was a carpenter," he said. "Taught me that the best repairs are usually invisible. Nobody notices when something works the way it's supposed to, but when something breaks and you fix it right, it often ends up stronger than it was before." They talked until the restaurant grew quiet around them. When it came time to leave, Frank walked alongside her wheelchair without hovering or making a show of helpfulness. He simply matched her pace the way he might walk beside a trusted colleague. At her car he waited while she transferred herself to the driver's seat and folded her wheelchair into the back. The whole process took several minutes and Frank stood nearby without commenting or offering unwanted assistance. When she was settled behind the wheel, he leaned down to her window. "He'd like to see you again," he said, "if you're interested." Margaret looked up at this man who had spent 3 hours treating her like exactly who she was, not who she used to be or who she might become. just who she was in this moment. "He'd like that," she said, and meant it. Over the following weeks they fell into an easy rhythm. Frank would stop by her office after work still in his work clothes, and they would drive to quiet places where they could talk. Sometimes they went to the harbor where they watched boats come and go. Other times they found small cafes where the coffee was good and the pace was slow. Frank told her about houses he was building, and she shared stories about companies she was helping to rebuild. They discovered they were both in the business of making things stronger. One evening as they sat watching the sunset from a park overlooking the water, Frank said something that surprised her. "You know, when Helen first told me about you, I thought she was trying to fix us both. Like we were broken things that needed repair." Margaret turned to look at him. "But you're not broken," he continued. "Just different than you used to be, and different isn't the same thing as damaged." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been held too tight for too long. For 3 years she had been trying to prove she was still the same person. But Frank was the first person to suggest that maybe being different was actually okay. Maybe it was even better. Maybe the accident hadn't broken her. Maybe it had just revealed strength she never knew she had. That night when Frank walked her to her door, he stopped and looked at her seriously. "I need to tell you something," he said. "When Helen first described you, she focused on what had happened to you, the accident and how it changed your life. But that's not what I see when I look at you." Margaret waited. "I see someone who figured out how to build a life that works. Someone who knows that real strength isn't about avoiding difficulty. It's about finding a way through it." He paused and his voice grew softer. "I see someone I could love." Margaret had forgotten that her heart could beat that fast. Not from fear this time, from hope. 3 months later, Margaret sat in the same restaurant where they had first met. This time she wasn't waiting for a blind date. She was waiting for Frank, who had become as essential to her days as morning coffee. He walked through the door in a clean shirt and work boots. Still the same steady presence, who had never treated her like she needed to be fixed. As he sat down across from her, Margaret realized something. Helen had been right about the blind date. Not because it led to romance, though it had done that too, but because it had led to something more important. It had led to the discovery that being seen clearly by another person is one of life's greatest gifts, and that sometimes the things we think break us actually just clear away everything that was never really necessary. Margaret smiled at Frank across the table, ready for whatever they would build together, one steady piece at a time.